Okay, this is my week 6 final project. First I'm going to show creating it and then building the solution, and then I will run through it. So for my project, we wanted it to be related to physics because that's what my major is, and so I decided to turn a project into a projectile motion thing. And so what it does is it takes an initial velocity and an initial height, and then also an initial angle, and then calculates the motion of that projectile. So a couple big things to note with changes to extra libraries is first off, I used CMath, which is a very common library in Python that I was able to understand pretty well. And then I also defined this function right here, which I found makes it easier to use things in CMath. So like in my projectile part, I had to use sine and cosine, and using those makes it just a little bit easier to do that, as well as like pi and things like that. So first off, I used standard namespace so that I didn't have to write it on everything. And whenever I start the program, it creates a double for the velocity, launch angle, and height. That's going to keep track of it over time. And then I am going to start by checking to see if there's a valid input. And it takes a user input for the initial velocity, the angle, and the height, and then checks to see if those are valid. Valid inputs are velocities above zero, launch angles above zero, and then less than 90, and then initial heights, which are greater than zero. And I made it all into one line, which I thought was pretty nice. And if any of those are wrong, then it just gives it asks you to give a valid input and then runs you back through it again. After that, it comes down to here, where the first thing is that most CMath programs and Python programs calculate in radians. So I convert that launch angle, which somebody's probably going to put in as degrees, into radians. And then I made it so that it creates a projectile object, and that goes to the projectile class, which I'll go over in a second. And then it calculates that range and gives out the different values for you, including a couple of the things which I'll go over at the end. So as I go over to my projectile class, I have it set up so that it initializes all those different things that I sent in, and then it has different programs to call the initial velocity, the launch angle, initial height, and it goes all the way down. And then for the calculations, I just have it keep whatever constants it needed. Like in this case, I just passed it gravity being a constant by itself right there for the spots that the only spots it needs it, so it's not always keeping track of that. And then I have it return the calculation of the equation. And so like for the max height, I have it do the equation for the average or the height and then take it at the peak and things like that. And so then all of these each use their individual equation. We don't have to go through the rest of them. And then in the header, it's keeping track of initializing all of those. So all of my gets, all of my calculates are all public. And then it keeps the velocity, angle, and height localized to it so that they don't get messed up by other stuff. Okay, so back to my project then. Afterwards, I think after debugging, it only took me about 2 hours to write this part out after planning as well. And so I wanted to add in more stuff. And so those extra things were actually the max height, the time of flight, and the impact velocity. And that's when I kind of ran out of time to keep working on it. And so those ones were a little bit trickier to get to work fully, especially this impact velocity, because a lot of times whenever you're calculating projectile motion, it'll trigger when it hits the ground and then calculate one step below. So I took the step below, step above, and averaged those out to get the impact velocity for that case. Okay, so I'll go ahead and run it. And so first I'll show an invalid input. So let's say that I put initial velocity of 10, but then if I put a launch angle of -10, and then no matter what I put here, it'll say invalid and it'll have me try again. So if I go 10, 10, and then I do initial height of negative as well, it'll also ask me to redo it because if you're below the ground, it's not going to matter anyways. So I'll just set 10, 10, and 10. And so what it does is it says the range of the projectile at 10 meters per second, 10 degrees, and from a height of 10 meters is 3.49 meters. and the maximum height it reached was 0.15 meters. The time of flight was 0.35 seconds, and the impact velocity was 1.73648 meters per second. Looks like I need to fix that to be the absolute value, but that was the impact velocity as well. And that's my entire project.